as usual with these kind of people, he sort of deliberately omits to mention all the things that the government has been doing on obesity. Unprecedented stuff, some of which only came in this year.
They want these laws that basically mean that whatever they're doing, they're committing a crime. So there's always something you can get them on. And I think that's a kind of a new approach to lawmaking now. You want to kind of catch all.
It should never have been part of the Football Governance Act. There shouldn't be a football regulator anyway. And if there has to be a football regulator, it should be purely looking at whether, football clubs are financially viable and the people who own them are not criminals.
Hello and welcome back to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked, joined as I am in every episode by Chris Snowdon from the IEA. How are you doing, Chris?
I'm all right, Tom. Nice to be here as ever.
I'm also delighted to be joined by returning guest Josie Appleton from the Campaign for Freedom in Everyday Life. How are you doing, Josie?
I'm good, thanks.
And we should say at the top of this, Josie, that of course the Campaign for Freedom in Everyday Life is not a new organisation, but it is a renamed organisation. People will remember the Manifesto Club and its battle for our civil liberties over many years. What's provoked this rebrand at this point?
Just to be more descriptive in terms of what we actually do.
Exactly. Does what it says on the tin more so than...
Pretty long tin,
excellent.
big tin, but...
And we'll go into some of the work that you've been doing on Everyday Life shortly. Before we get into the topics we're going to talk about today, I just want to remind you all that the Spike Summit is coming up on Saturday, the 27th of June. We're having our biggest event ever, bringing together an array of speakers to discuss the big issues of our time. We've got Constantine Kissin, Lionel Shriver, Alison Pearson, Toby Young, Brendan O'Neill, Tom Slater, all kinds of star names. So if you want to get your tickets, make sure you go over to spiked-online.com to book up as soon as possible. It would be great to see as many of you there. And of course, if you're a Spike supporter, you can get a very healthy discount. So let's kick off, Chris, by talking about our old friend, Chris Whitty, who has intervened on the question of fat jabs at a lecture that he gave to some public health journalists. He's not a fan of Ozempic and all the rest of it. He seems to think it's a great kind of curse to proper public health policy. But do you want to tell us a little bit more about what he had to say about our old friends, the fat jabs?
Yeah, he's come up from under his rock again, Chris Whitty. It's a name that you think, should have sort of been forgotten, or it sends a bit of a shiver down your spine every time the name comes back, because he's so tied to the pandemic era and lockdowns. And another slide, please. It feels like he should have sort of gone away, but he hasn't. He's just not on TV as much. But I think he's as influential in government as ever, because he was apparently very much behind the whole thing of Rishi Sunak and then Wes Street and having a weird ban on smoking or sale of tobacco. And he's also been whispering the ear of the Prime Minister about obesity. So what he's got to say about obesity, and he basically takes the orthodox kind of public health establishment line on this, which is, we're not completely against these jabs. They do seem to work a bit for some people, but they're not the main thing. The main thing is what he calls public health, the public health approach. And he sort of creates this false dichotomy, really, between putting people on jabs and using this so-called public health approach. And I think his words were to the effect of, are we really going to consign millions of 18-year-olds to a life on Ozempic and put the effective public health approach that we know works to one side? Well, firstly, no one's suggesting putting every overweight person on Ozempic. It's entirely up to them if they want to be on it. In a few years' time, the jabs are going to be really cheap. And so there will be a sort of easy solution to the individuals who are obese if they want to take it, but no one's going to force them to, and the NHS certainly isn't prescribing that many of them at the moment. And also, clearly, the government is proceeding with what he calls the public health approach, very much so, more than any other country in the world. And as usual with these kind of people, he sort of deliberately omits to mention all the things that the government has been doing on obesity. Unprecedented stuff, some of which only came in this year, the advertising ban, the ban on buy one, get one frees and other volume price discounts, the mandatory calorie labeling in restaurants, the sugar tax, the traffic light labeling, the ban on putting so-called junk food in various visible places in shops. The government to the contrary of what he's implying. Government is gone overboard on this kind of thing. The thing is, none of it seems to be working. And the sugar tax certainly didn't work, and it hasn't worked anywhere else in the world. Advertising bans don't seem to work. And if this stuff was effective, we'd expect to see obesity coming down right now. As it happens, if obesity does start coming down around about 2024, 25, 26, it will probably be because of the fat jabs. So there's a possibility of some stolen valor here for people in public health. So they should be quite glad that the jabs have come along. Whether that will actually happen, I don't know. It just there seems to be hints of evidence in America that you're actually seeing the obesity rate declining a little bit, which of course should be the one and only outcome that you're looking for to show whether various policies work. And as I say, they haven't worked so far. And he's just basically insisting with this sort of not invented here syndrome that, the jabs are fine, but they're kind of marginal. Whereas the public health thing of just banning things and taxing things, that's clearly working, and we should proceed with much more than that. Whereas the opposite pretty much is the truth. He's also then gone on to say, when I guess probed as to what is his public health approach and where in the world has it worked, given that it hasn't worked in the UK, he said, well, just look at France, just look right over the channel at France. And it's true that France has a much lower obesity rate than us. He did say, this was incidentally to a room full of journalists for the annual medical journalists lecture. He said that the rate of obesity hasn't risen at all in the last 30 years in France, whereas it's doubled in the UK. That's actually not true. It's actually doubled in France, just from a lower base. It's gone from 18.5% to about 17%. So it has risen, but in this country, it's getting on for 30%. So there clearly is a difference. The question is, what has France done that the UK hasn't? What can we learn from France, other than fundamentally transforming our entire country, culture, and history to that of a foreign country? And the answer is nothing. I mean, they have got a sugar tax, just about. It was at a very low level for a very long time. Apart from that, they haven't got any of this stuff. They haven't got the bans and the calorie labeling or anything of the kind. So in terms of policy, there's nothing to learn. All he's done is point to a country which has a relatively low rate of obesity for whatever reason and said we should be more like that. Well, how?
It's a very good question for Josie, not least because of the fact you live in France and have done for many years. What do you make of this comparison that Chris Whitty was making, that we should just be more like the French and all of our problems here would be solved?
Yeah, well, I'm back and forth really. But yeah, I mean, I think France, they don't eat particularly healthily. I mean, kids go to school on baguette and Nutella pretty much. And I don't know how they last till lunchtime, but they do, and they have to make up for it. But I think the main thing that's different in France is just food is very social. So everyone gets together at meal times, even snacks. So they have a social snack, have goûter in the afternoon. So it's very much social regulation. So you don't eat to fill yourself, you kind of eat as part of a social occasion. And to the extent that students will go home at weekends to eat with their parents, which would be unthinkable, they go out and drink and not bother about eating, or eat at 2 a.m, chips or whatever, right? So, but that's just Southern Europe, isn't it? And that would be the same in Italy or other countries. And in Northern Europe, things are different. So the way you would regulate your eating would be different. I mean, I think the only thing the state could do for obesity would be rationing, probably, and North Korean exercise programs, which obviously isn't going to happen, and will be very undesirable.
You never know.
Well, no, they wouldn't, because it's all about the tinkering. It's not about the state actually imposing. It's about the state meddling and changing what you see, changing what you hear, changing all the environment around you in a kind of meddling, interfering way with it. And not actually, if they actually had to decide on a diet, they wouldn't be able to decide, right? Or an exercise program. So I mean, I think they don't actually have a kind of something they want to impose. It's just more that kind of tinkering, meddling, and everything. And yeah, in France there is very little of that. I mean, they have adverts for pretty much everything on the radio. They have a little health warning at the end, but they go, you don't even hear it. It's so fast. So I think it there are different ways. I think in this country, my argument against fat jabs would be it takes away from willpower. You can balance your own body through choosing what to eat and exercising. But his argument is actually like it takes away from the public health bureaucracy and our power, which is like worse. Which is actually, what he hates about it is the independence of it. Like someone has an injection, they can just give themselves once a week, and that's it, right? They don't have to see a doctor, or there's nothing for the state in that. It's just they got their independence in a way. So, I mean, personally, I don't think don't sound like the worst thing in the world. Kind of pretty much a replica of a hormone the body produces. It could be worse. A lot of other drugs are worse. But yeah, for me, the argument against it would be just it takes away from your kind of ability to balance your body, and if you stop taking the jabs, then you might lose that balance. But it doesn't seem like the worst thing in the world, and it's certainly not his concern, which is basically we don't have takes away from our power to meddle incessantly with everything, and the less it works, the more meddling they come up with.
No, absolutely. And Chris, you've already touched on it here, but reading his comments, it was quite telling of the pretty reductive worldview that the public health establishment have. There's this thing called the market, which is kind of evil and trying to influence us. There's this thing called public health policy over here, which is trying to nudge us in the right direction. But there's no seeming appreciation of, as you were saying there, kind of the culture of a particular place, the way in which people tend to eat, just patterns of behaviour. Is that just part of the blinkerness that is always built into these kinds of decisions that are made by government and so on?
Yeah, I mean, these people talk a lot about the obesogenic environment and so on, but yeah, as when they just use the rather vague word or term public health, they don't really get into the nuts and bolts of what they mean by that. I mean, what Josie says is clearly correct, right? I have no doubt that France and some other European countries have a lower rate of obesity because of a culture that's grown up around food for hundreds and hundreds of years, which is not really amenable to policy, but it is a real thing. And I don't see how any amount of social engineering is really going to change that. It's a bit like drinking cultures. They're just a thing that countries have, and it's extremely difficult to try and shift them. If you look at Scandinavia, where they've been trying in a very heavy-handed way to change drinking cultures over the last 100 years or so, they haven't really succeeded. I mean, by using very high taxes, they've kind of managed to suppress alcohol consumption overall, but they haven't been able to change the way people drink in the sort of binge drinking culture, the spirits drinking culture, certainly not as much as they would like to do. So, you're right that these people have ultimately quite a small and fairly feeble set of tools with which to try and achieve something that probably can't be achieved. And I guess to sort of steelman what Whitty's saying, he would say that if you have 101 different nudges all pushing people away from ultra-processed food and snacking and so on, then you can make the UK more like France. I just don't really think that's true. And insofar as it is true, it would be a pretty negligible change at a fairly enormous cost. So he's basically just fantasizing about, what public health can actually do. It's interesting, he didn't mention any specific policies when he was talking about this. He just said, oh, well, look at France, it can be done, kind of thing. Well, like I say, it hasn't been done in France via policy. It's just that, different countries and different cultures are different, and he kind of needs to accept that.
You can't create a culture. You're never going to take the Vikings out of Scandinavia. That's going to have their drinking horns. And I think the way that one would lose weight in our culture would be different. It would be in a sort of Protestant manner, in terms of wanting to feel better and improve your capacity. It may be that fat drugs would help that in terms of you could then do more exercise or whatever. But that's perfectly possible. I know several 13-year-olds at a certain point just decide they're going to be healthy, and that's the Protestant way of doing it, I think, rather than having endless meal times, which it takes a lot of time, incidentally. I mean, it's really a lot of time having meals. And it's very restrictive. You can't do anything on a Sunday.
And we've got to get this country back working, so we can't be having, endless sociable meals.
What do you mean you can't do anything on a Sunday, Josie? Have they got a Sabbatarian movement?
Well, sacred Sunday lunch with the family, an extended family. And yeah, I mean, no, some people do things on a Sunday, but there's a very much, so l'heure de this, lunchtime, now it's goûter time, now it's snack time, now it's, it's always some kind of mealtime.
Yeah, it takes too much time, I think.
And you have to come home from wherever you are as well.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't like it. I'd like to eat and get on with my day. They make literally a meal of it.
Josie, let's stick with you and an issue that you've been taking up recently, which I'm sure has been scandalising people across the country, causing outcry and demands that something must be done, which is the excessive car honking epidemic that we seem to be facing. As I understand it, this is another form of crackdown on, mildly irritating but not necessarily that problematic behaviours under the banner of public space protection orders. Do you want to tell us a bit about what's been going on here?
Yeah, so public spaces protection orders are powers that allow councils to ban pretty much anything they want in a public space. And so a single council official, if he's given or she is given the power, could just sort of write a law, and pretty much the next day it's law. There are very few procedural requirements. So it's kind of like a dream for officials that they can just write the law overnight. And so there's a lot of car cruising PSPOs at the moment, and they do come from a problem, which is people kind of having meets where they do donuts and skids and that sort of thing. But they've drawn these laws so broadly that they criminalize pretty much anybody in a supermarket car park. So they criminalize displaying vehicles, congregating in vehicles, playing your music, playing the radio after you've stopped the car, keeping the engine on after you've stopped the car, and excessive honking is a big thing, yeah. So I don't know how they measure excessive honking, but basically excessive foul language as well, or sexual suggestions, apparently that's a big thing. So you have these laws that would pretty much criminalize everybody, any kind of gathering. So certainly antique car enthusiasts. So my father-in-law would be breaking these laws pretty much every weekend, because they gather in cars and look at each other's cars, and that's kind of what they're into. So I think it's one of those prime examples of having a problem, but then creating a crime that's pretty much everything that could be conceivably around that problem. So if you take a photograph, or if you're selling burgers to people looking at their cars, or if you take a photograph of a car, then that's a crime too. Or if you allow someone to use your car to go to an event to look at someone's car, I mean, it's that sort of thing. It's like, then you get the fine too. So it is kind of pretty much criminalizing everybody. And I think the point of that is not necessarily to issue hundreds of fines, but it's really for the police. When the police want these, they want to be able to turn up to any gathering and to say, you're committing a crime. And so they want something on their book that says that everyone's committing a crime. Because they had this thing, they turned up at a car meet and it would just be these boy racers with their cars, like revving a bit and looking at each other's cars. And I mean, it's not my thing, but it's like, that's kind of the point of having that sort of car, because you're not going to really drive it on a racetrack. So it's kind of what it's for. And the police would turn up at these events and they'll be like, they're not really doing anything much. They're just revving and looking at each other's cars. So, but they don't like them, and councils don't like them. Maybe some members of the public don't like them. So they want these laws that basically mean that whatever they're doing, they're committing a crime. So there's always something you can get them on. And I think that's a kind of a new approach to lawmaking now. You want to kind of catch all. So you kind of want to add something and add another thing, another thing, another thing. And then you say, if anyone's doing anything that could possibly annoy anybody, I mean, literally they have laws that say that now. If you're doing anything that could cause annoyance to another member of the public, then you can be asked to leave or you can be fined. So it's that kind of catch-all approach where you just draw the net as big as you can and scoop everyone up in it, or have the potential to scoop everyone up in it, which is not really what a crime should be. I think it's always been a case that you try and define as tightly as possible what the action is and what penalty is. And certainly the kind of first criminal codes, they didn't say, oh, if someone's annoyed by something, it would be like, someone hits you on the head and this much blood falls on the ground, then you have to pay this. They would try and be really precise, like how much blood, how many eyes did you lose, exactly what is the what is the harm that's been done to you, and therefore what should be the penalty. And you know, I think that over time that was what criminal law was. How can you be as precise as possible? Like, how can you really define as precisely as possible what is the nature of the harm in a standardized way? So you can look at somebody who's been bashed on the head, you can say, okay, that is that degree of bashed on the head, right? It's not just a general bashing on the head, right? But now they want it as vague as possible, as kind of as nefarious as possible, just as it could be anything, right? You read these laws and you're just like, that could be anything. That could be anything. That could be anybody. So I think that's the kind of general trend behind it, is that complete loss of precision in writing these laws, and lack of interest in being precise, because they don't want to be precise. They want to have a completely free hand for the police officer on the ground to be able to say, we're committing a crime.
And what do you make of this, Christopher, as someone who can also often be found of a Saturday revving his engine or making sexually suggestive comments in a supermarket car park? What did you make of this particular bit of research?
Yeah, well, I'm worried this is going to stop me doing as many donuts down as the car park with the lads, playing my loud drill music. It seems to me yet another example of the government inventing new laws rather than enforcing existing ones, or maybe not being happy with the extent of existing ones, possibly, but I think probably the former, because look, I can definitely see how boy racers would be potentially annoying, creating a breach of the peace, dangerous driving even, but I don't see why the existing laws we have against any of those things wouldn't be sufficient. You know, if they're revving the engines very loudly after 10 p.m. or something, presumably there would be some sort of law about noise that they'd be breaching. If they were driving at high speeds anywhere, I assume they could get done for dangerous driving, and indeed probably another 5 or 6 other different laws that would cover the same kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, it's very interesting what Josie says. I'm sure she's right that this is just to give extremely enormous amount of latitude to the police, maybe because there have been 1 or 2 cases in which the defendant has found some loophole and said, actually, this is not technically illegal. I don't know. I doubt it. I mean, what we would want ideally in society is common sense to prevail. And maybe in the old days, the copper would turn up and say, come on, lads, knock it off. Otherwise, you're going having a night in the cells. And there wouldn't be any human rights lawyers to stop them doing that. But at the same time, nor would the police necessarily just be going around bullying people who are minding their own business. But it seems now we need to have a million laws covering every single thing. And the danger, of course, is that the police then do not use common sense when followed, and indeed think, well, this is technically against the law, therefore I must intervene. It seems to me like just a lack of moderation, and I'll say it again, common sense is not there, and so the law is having to step in at every single stage. But encouraged, of course, by busybodies who want to have some kind of law to prosecute everything. How would it work in France, by contrast, Josie?
I have no idea. I mean, I've seen a lot of antique car. There were a lot of antique car meets for sure, but I'm not sure there's the same boy racer phenomenon.
They're too busy making that tea, probably.
Too busy having that. But I guess the sort of 4 areas might. I don't know. I don't actually know, but but I think that's right about there being loads of laws against anything that's actually a problem. I mean, and some more severe laws. If you're actually doing a dangerous stunt and speeding, then you can lose your license. You would lose your license, right? And potentially even if you injure anyone, you could get imprisoned. So that's a very serious law, and they're replacing that with a law saying there's a £100 fine. So you could do a donut and hurt somebody and get £100 fine. So it's that kind of downgrading of actual crime. I think the police now are more interested in things that might go wrong or might happen rather than something that has happened. So they're like, oh, there's this gathering and something, let's nip it in the bud. That's the phrase they use before anything happens. It's like that preemptive. If there's a kind of social gathering of some kind, it could go wrong, and that's what they're interested in more than actually somebody committing a defined crime. So they want to go and they want to police everybody apart from the criminals.
It's very well put. Shall we talk about the new football regulator for England that we've been seeing develop? And surprise, surprise, there's already been a fair amount of mission creep. Kick It Out, which is the anti-racist, quote unquote, group within football, have been protesting because they feel like the regulator, as it's being sketched out, doesn't do enough on the question of DEI. They want, as I understand it, kind of mandatory reporting of diversity in the workplace, as well as various other measures. Chris, you picked this story out. What do you make of this?
It proves everything people like me were saying about the football regulator. So the football regulator, if you recall, was deemed necessary, despite football being arguably the most successful industry in the entire country, because of, well, two things were used as excuses. Firstly was the proposed European Super League, which was never actually going to happen because the fans wouldn't have it. Although, Tom, we would have loved it because it would ensure that Spurs would be in the top flight forever, wouldn't it?
Exactly, it would have locked us in at just the right time.
Be happening at the moment.
Exactly. If they were doing that European Super League now, we would never get anywhere near it. So I've changed my position on it purely on the basis of that.
Happened at the time, you would have been stuck there as a
exactly.
quote big club forever.
We'd be in the European Super League and in the Championship.
Boris Johnson kicked off about the European Super League to show he's a man of the people. Said, "I'm not going to let this happen. It was never going to happen, and it's not really any business of government anyway." And then you had Bury FC, not United, it's Bury FC, isn't it? They went bust. One of a very, very small number of clubs actually to go bust, but it does happen from time to time. And apparently that's not acceptable in an industry for one business to disappear. So we had the football regulator and the IEA, many others were saying this is going to be a nightmare. It will immediately move on from its core objective and start interfering in all sorts of different ways. And you're going to have the fans supposedly are going to be in charge of how much your ticket prices are, but also how much it spends. And is that really going to be a recipe for good governance? And sure enough, it only was created last summer and already it's embroiled in this EDI thing. So what's it called? Kick It Out, which used to be known as Kick Racism Out of Football, but is now a multi-million-pound company that is involved in advocacy in all sorts of ways. They don't seem to have anything concrete to complain about, actually, because the football regulator hasn't said exactly what its EDI policy is going to be. It has said that equality, diversity, and inclusion is a key element of the Football Governance Act. Why? Why is it? Why is that? Yeah, how does that stop clubs going bust? I don't know. It's nothing to do with having dodgy owners who might put the club in peril. It's just trendy nonsense as far as I'm concerned. And so Kick It Out said, we're concerned that the football regulator is not going far enough on this EDI stuff, I guess, to try and push it in a more interventionist direction. The stats on this are quite interesting. Said that 22% of roles in board and senior leadership teams are women. 0.3% are from LGBTQ plus backgrounds. These are obviously lower than you would expect from the general population, but this is kind of one of the problems with enforcing EDI onto all sorts of different industries, is that you just wouldn't expect these figures to be representative of the general population, because no matter how much the BBC tries to ram women's football down our throats, the fact of the matter is that men are much more likely to be keen on football than women are, and you need to look at the crowds to see that very, very, very clearly. There's a huge gender imbalance amongst people who actually like and watch and go to football. So it's hardly surprising that that's going to be reflected in the board and obviously on the pitch, right? This is men's football we're talking about primarily. And it's always been a bit of a surprise why there aren't more black people in particular sort of on the boards of things, and there's not as many managers as you might expect, although obviously that is changing. But on the pitch, clearly there is a huge overrepresentation of people from ethnically diverse background, black players in particular, and they're the ones who made the money. Football is an unusual industry in that respect. It's not the people on the board generally who are making the highest salaries out of it. But of course, they have to kind of put that to one side the EDI people on this particular occasion, because what you've actually got is incredibly rich players, a disproportionate number of whom are from ethnically diverse backgrounds. And so they focus on the board instead, which is, why would you particularly expect the board to be 40% women? And there's a broader angle to this, of course, which is that this stuff is being imposed on boards of any large organization now. And so companies, if they want to list on the London Stock Exchange, have to have at least 40% of women on the board, and have to a woman being at least one of the very senior board positions. And this seems to actually be having a tangible effect on the number of companies that are listing, because they just go, sod this, why should we go through all these stupid hoops where we could list in New York anyway, which has various other advantages. So this stuff should never have been part of the Football Governance Act. There shouldn't be a football regulator anyway. And if there has to be a football regulator, it should be purely looking at whether, football clubs are financially viable and the people who own them are not criminals.
What do you make of this, Josie, and this bizarre mindset that we're still stuck with, which is that if there's not perfect representation in any setting, something must be wrong and something must be done?
Yeah, I think in France a few years ago, there was a secret quota for white players for the national team. Because there weren't any. That's obviously not because there was discrimination against white players. They just weren't very good white players because they were playing tennis and rugby. And, so I think that's sort of social life. Different groups have different cultures and different preferences. And that means that certain people are channeled towards some things and others towards other things. And I think that this kind of idea that you need to absolutely represent the demographics of every community and every institution is bizarre. And I think it's really about institutions being accountable to committees and not to their mission or their audience, because what the public sector equality duty, a lot of it is about publishing your statistics, publishing your report on time, monitoring everything. It's that kind of documentation. It's like saying, like most institutions, when you're saying what should we be doing, you're like, well, how do we do our job as well as possible and please the people who follow us, right? That's the kind of thing. But this is really saying, actually, how do we please a committee, and how do we show them that we're representative, which is a kind of tick box thing. And that's to do with various sort of protected characteristics as well, which are sort of plucked out the air a lot. You could choose lots of other things. I mean, class isn't mentioned, for example. But it's like they've decided on these certain protected characteristics, and then the population has to be divided up in terms of those characteristics, which are not things that people identify with necessarily. And then that has to be mapped exactly onto every institution at every level, even though there are lots of reasons why people might choose to go into one area or another. And so it's that kind of very, it's bureaucracy, it's representation, is bureaucracy's idea of what representation means, which is not actually what it really means to represent people. I think if you get rid of discrimination, that's it, right? If you're just playing the best players, taking the best managers, taking the best coaches, whatever their background, that's what you want. That's the dream. That's always been the dream since the French Revolution. It's like, that's what equality is not discriminating. If you don't discriminate, that's what you need to do. You don't need to, and this is not about not discriminating, it's actually about constantly discriminating and dividing people up into these boxes which they may not identify with, and then kind of meddling with institutions to represent these boxes that you've just created, and discriminating, right? So that would be saying that we actually don't want a man for the job, or we don't want a white person for the job, or in France they want more white people, whatever, right? So it's actually about embedding that discrimination as a systematic thing and as a bureaucratic committee-led thing, which is as bad as social discrimination. That's not the dream. That's not the way you want it. What you want is for everyone to be thinking about what they're doing and not who somebody is, right? To think about the football and not to think about the background.
Absolutely.
And actually, sport is pretty effective in that, because because at the end of the day, you pick the person who can help you win. Like if you discriminate, you're going to lose because you're going to pick someone who's not as good. And so I say, well, sport is one of the areas where really it doesn't really matter. It's just how good are you with the ball? That's it. Or how good are you as a coach? And you would always want to pick the best person. And so you've got actually an industry it's really very kind of, pretty good in that respect. And then they're just trying to embed all this rubbish on it.
And do you think there'll be any more rubbish that's embedded into all this, Chris? Are we going to see net zero stuff, public health stuff? It's just the inevitable creep of projects like this.
Yeah, I think we'll see stuff on those two issues specifically, and many more. But it's just become almost immediately just another part of the blob. It will expand its reach. It will find reasons to create new departments for this and that, as indeed kick it out has. And ultimately it will work in its own interests as a part of the bureaucracy to keep itself relevant by finding new things to do. And every time there's any kind of issue that's all about football in the news, the government say we are going to give more money to the football regulator who can deal with this issue and deal with that issue. And ultimately it will make things worse. It will damage the game, I think. And there's absolutely no chance of the regulator under its EDI remit saying we're going to do more to get more white people into the Premiership on the pitch. I mean, which is really where the main financial inequality is. The thing with football is that if you're at all into it, you can see who's good and who's bad. You can't always see that on boards. That's the thing, and that's why there's various ways that companies actually get around these kind of regulations, which aren't particularly good. In fact, often are counterproductive. I mean, one way is if you need to have one one woman on the senior leadership, like those 3 or 4 people right at the top. Often they can be sort of nominal figures, really, right? And so you just get the same 2 or 3. You just get Shami Chakrabarti as on the board of every company going, because they don't actually need to turn up, maybe do 1 day a month or something like that. In fact, Kick It Out itself has its own special anti-Islamophobia department, right? And guess who runs that? Baroness Varsi. I bet Baroness Varsi is on the boards of loads of different organizations, purely to kind of tick that box. The other way they can get around this, somebody told me quite recently, is in order to get your overall gender wage more balanced, is you just employ more men at the lower level, which effectively means you don't employ women in kind of starting positions to make sure that your lowest paid people are all men. That's not really creating, well, it is creating more equality in a way, but only by denying opportunities to women to work for you in the first place. So there's all sorts of unintended consequences with this stuff when companies are forced to do something that they don't want to do and they don't think is actually good for their business. In order to make the numbers add up, there's all sorts of ways actually they can get around this and not helping anyone, in fact harming people.
We're fast running out of time, so let's go to our final 2 questions, Josie, that we'd like to ask all of our guests. First and foremost, do you have a theory that you would like to give to our listeners right now?
I actually don't have pet theories. All my theories are deadly serious, even if they're trash. But I guess, a theory about why the British state is more meddling than the French state. I think the thing is that the British state was always historically like really much more embedded in culture and social life, and it was much less formal. The state was run by volunteers till a very late stage. And as a result, I think it's better when culture is better. I think the British state is better. And when culture is worse, the British state is worse, because it's much more exposed. Whereas the French state has always been something that's kind of arched over society as a sort of very haughty, self-contained body. And so they've got their whole kind of world of state function, and they take it very seriously. Even just a ticket collector on the train or whatever has a certain bearing. They're kind of proud because they were representing the state. So and then you have the whole world of kind of training for state service and that kind of thing. So I think because culture has become much less free, the British state has become much more exposed to that. Whereas states that have their kind of ethos, then they kind of carry on doing the same thing, much more kind of conservatism. Obviously, a whole kind of constitutional element to that as well. So there's not, but as I said, I don't really have pet theories. They're all serious.
That's as solid a pet theory as any. And very finally, if you had to have one ban, what would it be? You have, I think, answered this question before, so I guess it's your second. But yeah, anything that's irked you of late, Josie, that you'd like to clamp down upon?
You are a dictator.
Actually, I think it'll be Zoom meetings in public places, like especially sort of HR, academic, middle management meetings. I don't mind pretty much anything, like the homeless person sleep next to me in the cafe. I don't have a problem. The Spanish tourist talking loudly, I don't have a problem. Someone starts a Zoom call about HR, I get so mad. And it's like, I think it's just like sending this soul pollution into the public environment, which is really reprehensible. So I think if you're going to have those meetings, you need to do it in private. It's in a kind of very enclosed place. Our Zoom meeting would be absolutely fine because it's not like that. But it drives me absolutely mad.
Because it reminds you of the existence of HR, basically.
Because it sucks the life out of your soul.
Yes, which is the same thing.
And hearing someone in a kind of otherwise convivial environment going through the motions of a deadening HR meeting, I mean, just that clash is awful.
Melanie didn't perform well in the last quarter of a meeting, and she hasn't done this or this. We need to review that policy and that kind of stuff. I just think, you're in a cafe, you're trying to write an essay or read a book, and it's not on.
I think that'll be a very popular choice. So do your Zoom meetings in private, get your tickets to Spike Summit, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Last Orders. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and click the bell so you never miss another Spiked video. If you're listening to this on your podcast app, make sure you subscribe there and give us a glowing 5-star review. And if you'd like to get in touch with your questions or band suggestions, email us at lastorders@spiked-online.com.